Man, we've got a lot to talk about when it comes to the Detroit Red Wings. So, what we're talking about here in this video revolves around two things, pretty much. We'll say three, just for the sake of including one more thing in there, but two things, pretty much. We're talking about free agents to be, and we're talking about interest, disinterest, and overall attraction to the Detroit Red Wings hockey team as a whole. Now, the big one that we're talking about at the beginning is Jacob Markstrom, but before we get into that, I did say that we sort of have three things to actually talk about. So let's talk about the very small, minor thing at the very beginning here first. We're talking about the prospects at the 2020 NHL Draft, because a few days ago we made a video talking about how the tides were kind of turning, how people were sort of thinking, okay, maybe the Red Wings are actually going to go with Rossi at 4th overall instead of Perfetti. But at the same time, there are still a whole bunch of other ideas and rumors to go around. We have ourselves what was the big idea from that video, and it actually had to do with Steve Yzerman himself, because we noted how in the Cole Perfetti interview, Steve Yzerman had his camera off, and he wasn't really talking all too much. He was just sitting there, he was just taking notes. We didn't know if that was an intimidation tactic. We didn't know if he was in a position where he wanted to really test out the prospects and see how they act when they know somebody who is of a very high hockey stature is watching over them, but they can't really see what he's doing. Well, we had ourselves Helene St. James, who came out and interviewed Yzerman and actually asked him, what were you doing? Why your screen was dark and mic muted during the Zoom calls of the prospects. He says he was doing yoga for most of the interviews, so he was trying not to be a distraction. Namaste, Stevie Y. So, that's a small little piece of news. Just thought I'd throw that in there because we're already on the topic of the Red Wings. But the big thing we've been talking about, aside from the prospects and the Mark Stahl trade, the last time we talked about the Detroit Red Wings was talking about Jacob Markstrom, the Vancouver Canucks starting goaltender, or at least he was the starting goaltender until he got injured and Demko became the starter with Demko as the backup. But Jacob Markstrom is the Vancouver Canucks primary starter. He is a guy who was very good. He was 4th place in Vezina voting this past season. He was an absolute G, the team's MVP for 2 years in a row, and he is becoming a free agent. Markstrom is in a position where many people in Vancouver are believing that as a pending UFA, he is one of, if not the absolute, main priorities for Jim Benning and his staff in terms of what their total offseason plan is. We've noted in the past that teams all around the NHL are going to be looking for goaltenders. We're going to have to see goalies on the move this offseason, just in terms of the status of all these contracts, where these teams are and their developments and their overall paths. We already saw Henrik Lundqvist got bought out. We saw Jake Allen get traded. We were on the cusp of seeing Devin Dubnyk ending up getting a trade. We saw Frederik Andersen's name in the trade block, as well as Matt Murray's. Goalies are going to be on the move. Both UFAs like Holtby, Robin Lehner, maybe Corey Crawford, Jacob Markstrom, etc., and goalies under contract alike. We're going to see a lot of movement here. And Markstrom's name has been one of those, because of the Vancouver Canucks goaltender controversy, where they have a very, very solid Thatcher Demko, who is number 1 in the entire NHL postseason for goalies over 3 games played in terms of save percentage and goals against average. He was an absolute monster against the Vegas Golden Knights. And the fact that both Markstrom, who is a Vezina 4th place caliber goaltender, and Thatcher Demko, who just absolutely tore the house off the roof against Vegas, are going to be eligible for expansion draft should they both stay for more than a year, it puts Vancouver in a difficult spot where they have to say, okay, are we in a position to get rid of one of these goaltenders, and if so, who's it going to be? Speculation has arisen that Vancouver wants to keep Markstrom, but if that is not able to happen, there will indeed be a market out there that wants him out. We have ourselves a tweet over here talking about Jacob Markstrom and the Red Wings, and in fact, it's Elliot Friedman on the 31 Thoughts podcast. He actually mentioned something about another UFA, not just Markstrom. One of the guys I heard the Detroit Red Wings were interested in was Andy Greene. I could see them having some interest in him. I think they've got some interest in Jacob Markstrom, too. Now again, first off, Markstrom in Detroit, not new news. We've talked about this before. Secondly, though, Andy Greene? That's a completely different idea. But before we go over on Andy Greene, let's talk a little bit about Markstrom more, because we spoke in a previous video talking about how the Red Wings are in a weird spot. because Markstrom is 30 years old. And he's a guy who probably could get himself a 4, 5, maybe even a 6-year contract. And goalies, while the timeline for their success is usually extending a little bit further past that of what is a normal skater, a forward, or a D-man, it's difficult to understand the idea of a Detroit Red Wings team who is young, who is going to be better in 5 years, going after a number 1 goalie in Jacob Markstrom now with the intention of locking him in foreseeably into the long term. Because for a guy like Markstrom, you know he's not going to take a short bridge deal. He's 30 years old and he's at the best shape of his life. He's not betting on himself to only take a 1 or 2 year contract. And in fact, the timeline of Markstrom being successful does not match the timeline of when the Wings are supposed to be successful too. So that whole correlation doesn't really work. Well, we don't really have to worry about that actually, because according to what was said on TSN 1040 here in Vancouver by Matt Sakaris, he's reporting that Markstrom will not go to a secondary market unless they're a serious cup contender. And per his agent, Markstrom will not consider a rebuilding team. It was mentioned specifically that Detroit is a no-go for Jacob. Okay, so there we go. That's the whole rumor shut down. No Jacob Markstrom in Detroit. He doesn't want to go over there, despite the fact that according to previous sources, Elliotte Friedman on the podcast, as well as our source earlier in a different video, the Red Wings would have wanted Markstrom. Apparently he wouldn't even think about it because, hey, they're not a cup contender, so why would he want to go there? However, we do have ourselves another story here. It's not just Jacob Markstrom, whom Elliotte Friedman noted the Red Wings wanted. It's Andy Greene, too. And this, to me, positionally, it makes sense, but logistically speaking, it kind of feels weird, because Andy Greene is a 37-year-old left-handed defender. He's been with the New Jersey Devils for 13 years, before he eventually was traded in the John Quenneville trade over to the Islanders, and then he played some games with the Islanders in the postseason. What Andy Greene is indeed a veteran, leadership-type defenseman who is going to be a UFA. And positionally, as I said, it kind of does make sense. Because earlier we did get note from the Red Wings that they were not planning to re-sign both Trevor Daley and Jonathan Ericsson, 2 defenders on the team who actually did suit up in some games. Well, how are they going to replace that? Sure, they have a Moritz Seider in the system that they can bring up and use, but what about some other options? Well, they traded for Mark Stahl. There's 1 defender coming back to replace either a Daley or an Ericsson. And now, if you have another veteran D-man in Andy Greene, who is going to be a free agent, that's 2. We noted this in the previous video as well, that the Red Wings' 2 main philosophies heading into the draft in the offseason are to A, stock up on prospects, stock up on picks, and to B, ice a team. Ice a team that can actually go out there and compete. Ice a team that knows how to play the game, and while they're not going to be amazing, nobody was really expecting Detroit to be all too great anyway. Use their first-round pick in 2021, get another very good prospect, and by the time Veleno, Berggren, Zadina, Seider, whoever they pick at 4th overall this year, Greva, McIsaac, and all the other prospects they have in the system come up and actually start playing, they would have had some valuable life lessons, hockey lessons, playing lessons from the veteran guys, the leaders on the team, like the Sam Gagnes that they re-signed to a contract, like the Mark Stahl that they ended up trading for and also getting a pick back in return too, like the guys like Andy Greene who have been in this league for 13 years already. So there certainly is an idea in my mind that understands why exactly Andy Greene would be here in this position, why the Red Wings of all teams would want to get an aging left-handed defenseman as just another guy to add on their roster. It's just kind of interesting because we saw Yzerman say that he, by proxy pretty much, wants to take advantage of teams that have to move out money. It's just kind of interesting because if you wanted another D-man, I don't doubt that there's probably a nice, older, veteran defenseman who's on a poor contract who's on a team that needs the money. I don't doubt that there's probably a few more guys out there. We talked about some of these options in the previous video. But, of course, there are indeed several ways and different philosophies you can do when it comes to filling out a roster that can actually compete. So, I don't know. To me, Andy Greene was a guy who wasn't really all too amazing in the Islanders postseason. I mean, I watched a lot of the Islanders games, and he played. He was okay, but, he just didn't play a lot. He wasn't really used all too often. So whether or not that's something that gets brought to Detroit, we'll see that later. But for now, comment down below what you think. First off, about Yzerman doing yoga during the Zoom interviews. Secondly, about Jacob Markstrom and the Vancouver Canucks. Thirdly, about this Andy Greene thing. Talk to me in the comments what you think. I hope you enjoyed this video. That's Trollus 99. And bye.